Welcome to this month's Bookends. This month we're featuring Eric Dregni and his book called For the Love of Cod. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. This month, Eric Dregni will talk about his popular travelogue about Norway's colony in America, Minnesota, in his book called For the Love of Cod. He is a freelance writer for Metro, the Norwegian-American Weekly, and the Minneapolis Star Tribune. His first book, in Cod We Trust, was a runaway riot. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to put a message on chat if you're online, or we'll have a question and answer period here. BookEnds Online Edition is produced this month by Travel and Story Seller. Like other bookends, this program will be recorded and made available on YouTube. Now let's welcome Eric Dregni. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, it's a treat to come up here in this hot day in this cool place. Okay, so I'm gonna start giving a little bit of a background here because I'm mostly I'm going to talk about For the Love of Cod today, but I want to talk a little bit about the background with my experience going over to Norway and such. And that's what I wrote about in Cod We Trust. Now, I was my wife and I had been living over in Italy for a few years, and we came back to Minnesota. We thought we wanted to go back. We heard about these great Fulbright fellowships to go over and study anywhere. And we thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to be able to go back to Italy, but actually pay and have some, not be like dirt poor all the time over there. So I was a student at the university, and a graduate student in the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. And I thought, I went into Johnston Hall there and the graduate office and checked everything out. And they said, well, you know, everybody wants to go to Italy and France, Germany, England on these Fulbrights, but we have this one exchange over to Norway that they do every year. When a student from Norway comes to the U and vice versa. And they were pushing this, and I thought, well, doesn't everyone want to go live in one of those countries with a really high standard of living, you know, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Netherlands. And so I thought, well, I would apply for this. And the interview went terribly. And then, so I kind of gave up on this whole idea. A couple of months later, I got a call from the U saying that I'd won this fellowship. At the same time, though, Katie, my wife, showed me this little piece of plastic. She said, now, do you see an extra little line there? Turns out she was pregnant. So what are we going to do? You know, our first kid, are we going to have in a foreign country where we don't speak the language? We have some distant relatives somewhere, I don't know. So she was very ambitious, and, you know, we'd lived in Italy, and, like, you know, we knew that Norway probably even has really good hospitals and everything. So we decided we would try to do this, to go for a full year over to Norway. Well, I started looking into how the health insurance and all of that would work. And it turns out that the State Department funds Fulbright. Okay, so the State Department, so it's all the health insurance there. It's the same as our congressmen and women and our senators and everyone. And you hear that it's the best health insurance in the world, right? You've heard that. Well, the fine print said pregnancy is a pre-existing condition. So if you sign up and you're pregnant, they will cover it. Amazing. Like as if it's some sort of disease, right? Okay, so I had to call over to the International Student Office in Trondheim, where the university where the exchange is, and explain, okay, well, we're not going to be able to come over because we don't have any health insurance, and I'm a poor student, can't afford any of this. And the woman over in Trondheim was like, oh, you can't afford what? She didn't understand what I was talking about. So I explained, we can't pay out of pocket to the Norwegian health system just to have a baby in a foreign country, and who knows what's going to happen if something goes wrong. And she said, oh, you Americans, you have very strange problems. This is not a problem in Norway. You come over here and you have that baby and everything will be just fine. So she seemed pretty convinced about this. So we packed everything up. We shipped off to Trondheim in July. Yeah, about this time. we got there, and well, something I learned in Norway, the summer there, everything kind of closes down because it's sunny all the time. There's essentially no darkness. And because they have in the winter what they call the mørketiden, which is the dark time. And so then once the sun comes out, everyone's just like, okay, I'm gonna go to my hutta, my little cabin, I'm gonna go out on my boat. Just, government offices were essentially closed until about September. So we had to wait until September to go downtown Trondheim to what they call the Trygdekontoret, which is the insurance office. And so they gave us all these documents to fill out to get on the Norwegian national insurance system to help pay for the birth. And so filled out all this stuff with our little Norwegian dictionary to translate everything, presented all these documents at the window, and the woman there looked through them. Just like, okay, so it was like, okay, what are we gonna do? We're stuck over here. I'd given up my insurance that I had as a graduate student at the U, and she said, no, don't worry about the insurance. The Norwegian government shall pay for the birth. I just don't know if you're eligible for the extra maternity benefit. It's like, what's all this all about? Okay. So it turns out if Katie had been working in Norway for 6 months, she would get a full, at that time, she would have gotten 42 weeks off of work paid for by the government, and I would get a month off. Okay. And now it's actually up to 52 weeks, a full year off of work, full pay, to help with your child and everything. Okay. And that's just standard. But they said, yes, you're not going to get that. I'm sorry, but you will get the $5,000. So we were actually, not only did they pay for all of the health insurance, all the medical stuff, and the taxi ride an hour to the hospital and back, but they would give us $5,000 to have a baby. So if you know anyone who's pregnant, ship them off to Scandinavia. So Sweden and Denmark, Finland, they all do the same thing as well. So they actually paid us to have a baby over there. And now that $5,000, I'm sure, is probably $10,000. So anyway, when we then moved back to Minnesota, okay, another thing, besides the $5,000, they also say they deposited $150 into our bank account every month for the baby, right? To pay for diapers and food and everything, okay? And they said, well, this will be continued until the baby is 18 years of age. Wow. So every family, or all your kids, each kid, you get $150. And so when we moved back to Minnesota, they actually kept depositing this money into our bank account. Okay? And we're like, well, we're not Norwegian citizens, we're not moving back there. So I had to sit down and write this letter to the Norwegian government, please, Norwegian government, stop sending us all your money. So, which I think back now, okay, so he's now, more than 18, and 18 years, $150 times 12 months in a year, times 18, that's a lot of money. And if we had 2 more kids back here, if I could have got them on the Norwegian government system as well, we'd be set. Yeah, because when we had 2 other kids back in Minnesota, the deductible on our health insurance for a family is now something like $5,800.
Wow.
So the difference to be paid or that, it's almost $11,000. And when you're having a kid, it's like your worst financial time in the world, right? It's like, it's just a disaster. Like, no one should have kids, right? Financially, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. So anyway, that was our experience over there. We came back to Minnesota and had 2 more kids here. And then about 5 years ago, I heard that suddenly Norway was declared the happiest country in the world. Maybe you heard about that. It had been Denmark for a long time, and then it was Norway. So Norway was gloating to the Danes, and now it's Finland, and it kind of goes back and forth with the Scandinavian countries. And I thought back about our time over there, and I thought, well, happy? I don't know. I mean, happy. What does that word mean anyway? And Norway, Norway's very squared away in many ways. It's very clean and safe and all of these things. but happy wasn't the word that came to mind. Because we had lived in Italy, and for 3 years we'd lived over there, and I thought, well, the Italians, they're often like out on the piazza, they're hanging out, having, coffee and all that with all their friends, and it's just kind of a more sort of joyful place in many ways. But then I thought, well, with the Italians, they're also always complaining. They complain about everything. It's like if they don't have, the best wine, the best art, the best clothes, the nicest clothes, the fastest cars, everything has to be the top. And if it's not, it's no good, right? They're complaining all the time, right? And with the Scandinavians, I guess they just don't do that so much. So was kind of the idea here, is like, obviously we missed something. If Norway was the happiest country in the world, like what was going on with all of that? And so I started checking things out. I wanted to do a little tour then. And I called over to my friend Inger, who is in Oslo, and I asked her if those Norwegians indeed are so happy. And she said, happiness here in Norway, we have bad weather, the highest prices for beer, and things are so expensive. In Minneapolis, there was the honorary Danish consul, and I asked her, like, with the Danes, why they're so happy. And she said, the Danes are so happy because they have low expectations. If you don't expect anything good to happen, everything is fine. I wake up thinking I could be dead. If I'm alive, then I'm happy. So it's kind of a low bar there, right? So I thought, okay, we have to go back, and I wanted to bring our son, who here was as a baby. I wanted to bring him over because he was very proud of being Norwegian. I mean, even though they don't do birthright citizenship, he wasn't given Norwegian citizenship for being born over there. But I wanted to take him back. So I had big plans. We were going to go travel all around Norway and figure out how happy they indeed are. The problem is I figured out, okay, 2 plane tickets and then hotels, which are easily $200 a night in Norway. That all of a sudden there's no way, like being a teacher, there's no way we can afford it. So I had big plans that we're going to go. He would fly into Bergen, and then we would take what they call the Hurtigruten, which is the coastal steamer, up to Trondheim, where I was a student, go around the university, and then we would take the train all the way north of the Arctic Circle to a town called Buda. And where I still have relatives up there. And then we would fly down to Oslo and stay with some friends down there. So I was over there. I paid for my ticket because I led a group of people around Norway. And then Aleph, who was 15 at the time, would come over and see me. He would come. And so Katie was back in Minneapolis. And so she prepared to put Aleph, a 15-year-old, on the international flight from Minneapolis to Bergen. A KLM representative told her that we could pay extra to have them watch over him as an unaccompanied minor. You mean like babysitter? Aleph gasped. The representative told her that it was indeed mostly for young kids who were brought to a special kids area in the airport. Like daycare in a play area? Obviously you don't trust me, right? So he's 15. He thinks he can do anything. The representative confided, actually, if he's responsible, you probably don't need it. Aleph insisted, I'll be just fine on my own. Katie nervously went over with Aleph how to transfer planes in the Amsterdam airport. And if you've ever been to that airport, you know how big it is. She would drop him off in Minneapolis, and I'd pick him up on the other end in Bergen. What could go wrong? So I was there in Bergen. I was staying with a friend there, and he was very handy with his cell phone, which I'm not. And he had a special app on his phone that charted all of the different planes coming in. And we figured out which plane was coming from Schiphol in Amsterdam to Bergen. But the plane just kept circling and circling overhead as we waited. And then we got the news. We're going to Warsaw, he texted. I immediately went over to the KLM desk to ask why the plane wasn't landing and to get some clarification on this bizarre message. The KLM representative scrambled around, consulted her computer, and said, we have no idea what's going on with that plane. Not good. Are you serious? I asked. Don't you have any contact with the plane? Why would the plane be going to Warsaw? She had no answers, which of course made me conclude that the plane had been hijacked with our 15-year-old unaccompanied minor aboard. He'd been taken hostage by Polish terrorists, if there even was such a thing. It didn't help that Aleph had stopped responding to texts. As I found out later, the phone's battery was nearly dead. Besides, you're not supposed to use your phone on the plane, right? Because it messes with the navigational equipment. Despite the 7-hour time difference, Katie called from Minneapolis, and we desperately tried to figure out what was going on. Finally, Aleph texted that he had misheard the Dutch, Norwegian, and German announcements over the intercom, and that the plane was going to Oslo, not Warsaw. The KLM representative confirmed this and added that the plane was having problems with its landing gears in one of the wings and needed a longer runway in Oslo. Somehow that didn't calm our fears. Aleph had navigated through the Amsterdam airport flawlessly, but now the airline was sending him alone to the wrong city more than 6 hours away by train. By the time we figured all this out, the plane was about to land in Oslo. But what would he do there? Would they just turn around and send him back to Bergen? I called the KLM desk in Oslo to see if they could help him. All the passengers are now off the plane, the representative said. Wait, do you see our 15-year-old son? Is he just gone? Call him. He can come up to the help desk and either we'll get him on the next flight to Bergen or we'll get him a hotel for the night. He's 15 and a flight out the next day. His phone is dead, I explained, trying to remain calm, and he has no idea what to do. You need to find him. Katie called and we remembered that Aleph's godparents, Knut and Inger, live in Oslo. They saved the day by agreeing to pick him up at the airport, if they could even find him. Aleph finally managed to charge his phone and said he was waiting at Pepe's Pizza in the airport. We told him not to move and that Knut would find him somehow, even though he hadn't seen him for more than a decade. We waited impatiently. Inger called an hour later with news that Aleph was safe with them and had eaten enough for 3 adults. He was resting on the couch. Inger said he earned his Voksenpoeng for this adventure. He was a pro. She explained that Voksenpoeng are grow points or adult points that kids earn in Norway when they're extra responsible. Aleph was terribly proud of this. I didn't dare say that it reminded me of the potty charts we used to tape up in the bathroom when he was a toddler, when the little Irving McQueen stickers we placed each time on the chart, he used the big boy toilet. I was just happy that he wasn't in the dungeon of some Polish terrorist. Yeah. So we managed to go all the way up to Trondheim on the Hurtigruten. And when we were there, this was in May. And so in May, it's beautiful, right? If you're ever going to go to Norway, go to try to be there during 17. Mai, which is the big 17th of May festival, the Constitution Day, and everyone is out. So we're out in May, and it was finals time for all the students. So all their final exams were happening. And I was trying to convince Aleph to go to university over in Norway. So if he managed to do that, it would be completely free, right? And they've actually just changed that within the last couple of years. Now you actually do, Americans who go over there have to pay some tuition, but still it's far cheaper than a lot of the schools here. But the students there, for their final exams, they're super intense. So when I took classes there, the classes are great, lots of discussion, interesting, and then it all comes down to this 5 hours, sometimes up to 8-hour final exam for each class. Okay, and so they bring the students in, and the teachers essentially have to guard the doors. The students can't bring in any books, any notes, nothing. They can bring in like an apple and a sandwich. So they just have to sit there and write and write and write for hours. And so Aleph wanted nothing to do with that. He wants to go have a little bit more fun. So at the same time, there's also this bizarre cultural phenomenon in Norway called the Rus. And so these are the graduating high schoolers that essentially have about 2-3 weeks before their final exams. And so this is their last party before adulthood. Okay. And so I tend to think of the Scandinavians as kind of stoic and serious and all of that. And then this bizarre thing of the Rus is just kind of fascinating in a way. So these students are on a mission to have the craziest party possible with the most outrageous pranks. This coming of age blowout is a last hurrah of youthful indiscretion before the drudgery of adulthood. Unless someone is hurt, the police just look away. So essentially the Rus are above the law. Some of the tricks they do are baffling, like cleaning a kilometer of train track with a toothbrush, while others are brilliant, making giant troll footprints up an entire water tower in the middle of the night as if one of these monsters walked clear to the top. Well, I would have preferred to have Eilif admire the Norwegians and their bunads and the stave churches. The job of the Rus on 7 Mai is to mock the entire formality of Constitution Day and demand attention. My friend Magne complained, these kids nowadays, it's too much Rus, the music is too loud and they're too crazy. And you were never that way, I'm sure, our bus driver, Petr, said. I asked Petr about his time when he was Rus. I don't remember much, he said. I just know that my mom wasn't very proud of me when I was Rus. She said that at the Russetag, which is the Rus part of the big Constitution Day parade, I was passed out and duct taped to the hood of a car. So it's this weird thing. I mean, can you imagine giving a bunch of 18-year-olds free rein to do whatever they want? So they often would get a van or even a bus, paint it red, fill it full of beer, blast music, and essentially just have a 2-week party. I mean, it's just a terrible idea, right? It's super fun for them. And so there's lots of streaking, lots of, I don't know, it's just like they're kind of, as long as no one gets hurt, they do whatever they want, right? So it's very, very strange thing. Has anyone ever heard of that before? So if you go over there during that time, you'll see these Rus. And after about the 2nd or 3rd day of doing this, they're completely exhausted because, you know, like it sounds great, like having this big party, but a party is like 1 day, right? Okay. Anyway, so Eilif was much more interested in that than actually having to study and do exams. So as we went around and we stayed with people, we worked it out that we'd stay with friends and relatives the whole time rather than pay at hotels that we couldn't afford. And so that way we could ask people, you know, is Norway really such a happy place? Like, what is it that makes Norway so great? You know, why is it on this list? So finally, when we went up to Buda and then flew down to Oslo, we stayed with some other friends there and we asked them, so what is it about Norway that makes Norway such a great place? So our hosts there, Hans Erik and Anna, put us up for 3-4 days at their house. And our friends Knut and Inger, who saved Eilif from the airport, came over for dinner. And we discussed Norway's standard of living and supposed happiness. Knut said, in general, people here in Norway are pleased with their lives. But I think that perhaps we Norwegians have become a bit too smug, since we consider ourselves so peaceful and helpful and a bit better than other places. I don't agree with you, Inger, his wife said. It's because we're all in this together. We have a willingness to give up part of ourselves for the whole. You have to know about dugnad, Knut told me cryptically. He said this Old Norse word essentially means communal work. All neighbors chip in and help because you never know when you're going to need help. I had noticed the flyer posted on Hans Erik and Anna's refrigerator with the word dugnad in large capital letters that said, we have the opportunity to volunteer. Knut complained that the demands for dugnad are constant. He said the new fundraiser is selling toilet paper. Inger said, everyone needs toilet paper, so they figured it was perfect. I was amazed. You really have to sell toilet paper to your friends? Yes, and now we have 80 rolls of toilet paper in our house waiting to be sold, Knut said. do you want to bring some Norwegian toilet paper back to Minnesota? Anna explained, a father of a child at our school wanted to get out of this dugnad and just asked how much he needed to pay to not have to do this. But you can't do that. Everyone has to volunteer. Nope, otherwise we'd all just pay to get out of it, Knut said. Well, Inger added, he could just buy all that toilet paper for himself that he would use eventually. But then I suppose he'd need an extra closet to store it all. Anna said, dugnad is all about this community that it creates. Knut responded, yes, making community through toilet paper. So they had all sorts of interesting words and phrases and stuff that they talked about when I asked about their happiness. Because a lot of the things, you know, the birth benefit that I talked about that we had, on the healthcare and some of those other things maybe you've heard of. But then they started going down this list of other things. And I was mostly intrigued that when I would ask people, like, why is Norway such a happy place? They actually had a list all set to go. And I think if someone said, okay, Minnesota is now the happiest state in the Union, we'd have to think of it. Like, I mean, Minnesota is pretty great and squared away in many ways, but I wouldn't know, like, well, why are we so much better than Wisconsin? And, well, I mean, maybe Wisconsin's the obvious, sorry. Because that's our rival. But I mean, you know, it's like, we'd have to think about these things. So I'm going to show you some of the photos of our time and also some of the phrases that people would come up with about like why they were so happy. So here was little Aleph when he was born over there. And so he was one of the bargain babies, what they called. So these bargain babies, because we met some other foreigners who happened to have a baby at the same time, and they were like, oh yeah, this is kind of known, like if you want to have a cheap baby, go over to Norway. So yeah, if you can get over there. So there he was as a little adventurer, and there he was when we went over there. So I took him to these great, this is the Oslo Folk Museum with all these great old buildings, and you know, showed him all. I mean, because I love all this old architecture and such, and he could really care less. You know, he's 15 years old and whatever, you know, like it's fine. But so our question though, is Norway indeed the happiest place in the world? Like, what makes it so happy, and why was that? So when we were over there, and Sutnamai, this is in Bergen here, it certainly seems like the happiest place. If you get over there, like, everyone is out on Sutnamai. Okay, and I think about here, like the 4th of July, it's just a different thing, because there, everyone is in their best clothes and a bunad and all of this. But then also trying to figure out, well, what is happy? Like, what does that word actually mean? And I'd studied a lot of Norwegian, and my Norwegian's terrible because all the Norwegians speak English so well, right? But I thought, you know, these are some of the words that I thought, okay, gladly is like gladly, which is not exactly it. Hyggelig, you probably heard a lot about Hygge with all the books and stuff that you see, which kind of gets way too much play. It's kind of beaten into the ground. Koselig is maybe more like cozy. Luckily is more lucky. Anyway, there just wasn't a word that was like exactly what happy is. So I looked up the International Day of Happiness. So these are sort of the ideas that they use to say, like, okay, this is what the criteria for the happiest country in the world. And when you look at these, like trying to reach these goals, the Scandinavian countries do exceptionally well. Whereas, you know, comparing it to the United States or compared it to Italy, that we need some work in these departments, right? And this is where I think that we can really look to Norway and the other Scandinavian countries as sort of a model for some of these ideas. But then, as I said, Norwegians would often have this other list of why they were so happy. And so some of the phrases don't really translate so well into English. So one of them was this idea of a free upbringing. And what they meant is that, and I guess it's kind of how I grew up. I remember my mom just saying, like, stop watching TV, get outside, go ride your bike, go climb trees, just be home by dinner at 6 o'clock, okay? So we just, I don't know, like, there were never parents around, right? And now raising kids is a completely different story. Like it's this surveillance Orwellian culture that we always have to monitor our kids and have cameras on them. And if there's it's just a different world that we have to know where they are, and all of these like activities can't just be with a bunch of kids running around. Like they have to be monitored by an adult. And in Norway, the kids we see like these little 8-year-olds wandering around the sidewalks, and like, from my American point of view, I was like, where are their parents? Like, do we have to help them or anything? They knew where they were. That's their neighborhood, I mean, and that's how it used to be growing up here. I mean, maybe in Wadena, it's that way still. Probably more so than in South Minneapolis. But we had our friends Knut and Inger, they talked about their daughter, Ada, in Oslo. And when she was 13, she would go take the trick around town, which is the tram. All around town, she would take even the little ferries to go out to some of the islands to visit her friends, all alone. And that's just what they did, and that's just how they get around. And I think in Minneapolis, my daughter is now 13. Like, is that a good idea, or just to go around on all these buses by yourself? And I think we've kind of lost something there, that we don't have that. So the idea, this is something that's shared in Sweden and in Denmark, allemans which literally means everyone's right. And it's this idea that all of this land belongs to everyone ultimately. That sure, we may own it while we're here on Earth, but we're just kind of passing through. And the idea is that Norway is a beautiful country, but it's just a bunch of rocks, right? So 97, they farm about 3% of the land, 3 to 4% of the whole country, okay? Whereas you look at a place like Iowa, so Iowa, they farm everything, and it's like 96 or 97% of the land is farmed in Iowa. So it's the exact opposite. That's, of course, why they came here to actually have some nice farmland. But Norway, because it's just a bunch of rocks, it's beautiful for hiking, right? All these mountains and everything. And so if you want to hike through this area, and even though if it's privately owned, you can hike through. You can hike through anywhere that you want, essentially. And you can even camp on the land, as long as you don't leave garbage and it's not on farmland or something like that, or too close to someone's house. And I think about here, you go out to other land and it's like no trespassing, trespassers will be shot. I mean, all of this craziness here, like if you walk onto someone's land, they could shoot you and somehow justify that, which is of course insanity. But so this idea that you can go around and you can hike anywhere you want, I mean, obviously be respectful of their things. And then another one on their long list of things that makes Norway so happy, they'd always say, well, vacation. So they're guaranteed at least 3, usually 4, often 5 or 6 weeks of vacation a year. Okay. And it's written into law. Here in the United States, you're not guaranteed any vacation. It's only if your company or your employer decides they want to give you vacation that they have to do that. And it's usually, you're lucky if you get 2 weeks. My friends over there would always ask, so Eric, what do you do? Like, where are you going on vacation this year? So they go on these big elaborate vacations every year. They said, oh, this year we're going down to the Canary Islands, because last year we went to Italy, and then we went to Spain, and then we went here, and all of these amazing trips for extended periods of time. And I thought, wow, with 3 kids, we never go on vacation. Like, we go up to our family cabin for a week in the summer, and then I also actually I'm on my way up to the Concordia language villages, and we do a whole summer camp experience, but it's always working, They said that farmers in Norway, farmers can never take a vacation, right? Because you have animals, but they have replacement farmers who come in for a month and take over the farm and help out with the animals. so the farmers can go south. My friend Jofa in Trondheim even said that for a while, they would have replacement housewives coming in to kind of take over, like when the mother is just completely exhausted and can't do it anymore, that they would have someone come in and kind of tidy up and do all the laundry and all this kind of stuff. I don't think they're really doing that so much anymore. But this was always part of it. Always got to take a vacation, you have to take a break. And then you can come back reinvigorated to your work. Another term that I've actually started seeing a little bit around here now is called friluftsliv. It's this, literally means free air life. And it's this idea that every day you need to go outside on a little walk, on a hike or something. That it's essential to surviving. And especially in this age of Zoom, or that we're always in front of computers and all of that, that we need to get outside. And of course, maybe you know that there's a phrase in Norwegian that there's no bad weather, only bad clothes. So even if it's, we get pretty intense weather here in Minnesota, but you still have to get outside, you still have to enjoy the wilderness, okay? And something along that lines there, another term that they use sometimes is called jordnær, which literally means earth near. And it's this idea of being not just gardening and doing things around that, but sort of your community. What are you doing to help out your community? How are you? And they talked about it's like this, you have the history, your family history, your people around you. What are you doing to help out? Okay. And this is where, when you go to these places, this is up in the Lofoten Islands, that everything was always so tidy, that all of the houses are painted. I mean, there's very rare that I would see a house that was kind of chipping paint or something. They'd always maintain everything, even the farms were so tidy. And these little houses along the water are called rådbuer, which are the old fishing houses, because they didn't want to waste good farmland. Like if you could farm or garden, you would do that because you needed anything that you could have. So these ones, I just think all the maintenance that would go into this, because this was at low tide, and then tide would come up right underneath these houses. Then they're all around the shore there, and trying to maintain these pylons and salt water and such. And in some of these houses too, the crafty Norwegians in their living room, they would drill a little hole in the ground with a little door that they would open up at high tide, and they could sit there in the evening and watch television and fish. Yeah, they get fishes, right? So also in Norway, the mountains, the fjells, they're so kind of all-encompassing that you can't really get away from the earth here. I mean, here, with the plains, you can kind of not forget about it, but it's like it's not just all around you all the time. So this is where my relatives came from on the Lister Fjord, and it's just always there. So one of the criticisms that Norway gets is like why, and Scandinavia in general, why they're so happy. They said, well, of course they're happy. They're all exactly the same, right? This is from the outside. Okay, that's good. It's all homogeneous. They're all, they're all white. They're all everything, and it's like, I mean, there's maybe some validity to that, but at the same time, it seems like any group of people you get together, they're going to find reasons to fight about this and that or different issues. But there has been a lot of immigration into Scandinavia. And so it sort of changed the dynamic. Like, well, they've really had to ask this question, what does it mean to be Norwegian, right? And then what do you expect of these immigrants? Do they have to learn Norwegian? They have to wear a bunad. So this is on 17. Mai, the big Constitution Day, and with the bunads, like, well, what bunad do they wear? This is the big question that people are asking. And then what flag do they wave? Do they wave the Norwegian flag, or do they wave the flag of their home country? Like, what does it mean? And I found it kind of funny because in the US, we've always questioned, well, what does it mean to be American, right? I mean, the only people that can really claim that would be Native Americans, and then we're a nation of immigrants, and then different immigrants here and there, and it's always been kind of this open question, like, and so it's just that they're sort of dealing with it now. And then another question they get, another idea that people say, well, of course they're happy, they're filthy rich. And they are. It's wild how rich they are. Because when my great-grandfather left Norway in 1893, Norway was the poorest country in Europe, along with Portugal, right? And now it's the richest per capita. Okay, apart from Vatican City, but Vatican City doesn't really, it's the Pope. So the problem is they have too much money. Okay, they have all of this money that they've then, with all of this oil that they discovered in the North Sea, what they decided to do is rather than just letting Exxon or someone come in there and drill it all up and then like pay their taxes and like give some back to the government that way, that they decided this is for the benefit of all of Norway. So they formed Statoil, which is a state oil company, and all of the profits then from the oil go to the Norwegian government, which is the people, right? So they have, my last check is like $1.3 trillion in the oil fund. It's probably way more now. And the Norwegian people say like, well, why don't you just divvy up all this money to everyone in Norway if it's really ours? And the problem is it's so much money that it would just sink the economy because it's too much, right? No one would work anymore, right? So they only use about 3% of this oil fund each year. And it's usually like infrastructure or other things, like kind of big projects like that. This year, they've actually used it to help with the war in Ukraine. But so they have all of this money. And then also this idea that what they've decided to do is help, I mean, it's all about the taxes. Okay, so how their taxes are, we hear, I mean, I heard before going over there, all the Norwegians, they're just, on all the Scandinavians, they're just taxed to death, right? And that's not exactly true. Okay, so I talked to this Norwegian economist who lived in Minneapolis, and he said the tax rate in Norway for most people is pretty similar to the United States, the income tax rate, okay? And actually, in a lot of cases, it's lower. The big difference is the rich, like beyond, you know, $200,000 a year or whatever, that they are highly taxed, like beyond that level, okay? So they said, this is why, you know, we have in the United States, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and all those characters that are I mean, now they're almost trillionaires, they're multi-billionaires, that they actually work it out, that they pay almost no taxes. Sometimes they pay no taxes, but they pay very, very little taxes because, right? And so Norway, that just doesn't happen. And it used to be, this Norwegian economist told me that in the United States, we were actually at the same level between the rich and the poor in taxes as the Scandinavian countries through the 70s. So because of Eisenhower, so it's like 90% beyond a certain point it was taxed. And then it all began with Reagan's tax cuts in 1980. That was the difference, that the rich became richer and the poor stayed the same or got poorer, right? And so each successive tax cut has just benefited the rich percentage-wise. And so this is why we have these very wealthy people now. And in Norway, I mean, Norway, they're doing just fine. And they pay a lot of, I mean, they pay their taxes. Because talking to people about paying their taxes, I expected them to resent it. And they said, no, I'm proud to pay my taxes because this is what we do and we work together. And it really struck me when going around and talking with this book. I went down to Los Angeles, and I'm not very familiar with Los Angeles. I've been there once before, but I went down there with my daughter, who's now 13, and we found this beautiful hotel, this classic old hotel, the Millennium Biltmore, where all the stars used to stay, right downtown Los Angeles, and it was pretty cheap, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized it's right next to Skid Row. And I didn't, you know, dumb, I don't know, I didn't know all about Los Angeles, I always thought that Skid Row was just sort of an idea, like, oh, you're on Skid Row, but it's an actual place in Los Angeles. And it goes block upon block upon block, like some like 10 blocks in every direction. There are 80,000 people living homeless in Los Angeles. 80,000 people. It's just wild, you know, and I'm down in South Minneapolis, and there's been some tent communities that have popped up. And then I live in Longfellow neighborhood, and I live about 8 blocks from where the police station burned down. So there's been a lot going on down there. So, but then I thought with comparing that to Oslo, which is well about comparable to Minneapolis, maybe a little bigger. I didn't see any of that. Like, where are the homeless? Where are these? I mean, the last time I went over, I finally for the first time saw like a panhandler, but I've never seen that before. And this is, the Norwegians pointed out, well, this is the choice we've made as a society. We are not going to have people out on the street. They have a right to housing, they have a right to all of these things. And so essentially, they conquered poverty. And that may seem a little dramatic because, you know, there's always going to be richer and poorer, but it's one thing to have like ultra rich and then people living on the street, but they've kind of decided we're not going to have those ultra rich, and we're going to kind of bring this all together because we all do better when we all do better. And it went back to that idea of Dugna, of kind of the families. This is the statues in Vigeland Park in Oslo, that it's like it takes the community to raise all these kids and to help out and to bring all these people together, because like being in Minneapolis with all this stuff going on, like seeing like if we don't all chip in, it's like it's just going to get worse, right? Because it's a really, you should come to Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a great place, right? And this is where they would ask, when I would meet people, the common phrase they would ask, "Hvor kommer du fra?" Like, where do you come from? And I thought, in the United States, we usually ask, like, oh, well, what do you do? Like, what's your job? Like, as if that sort of defines you. And I think that is, I mean, it is important what you do in your job and all that. But like this idea, like, where's your history from? Where's your place? Where, you know, where are you people? Kind of that idea of the jordnar, of like helping out everyone around you then. And this is where, you know, look, this is one of the doors of one of the state churches, like just that attention to like preserving these beautiful old buildings. Like, I mean, this was a bank building and like the cool theater down here and the old, I mean, like downtown Wadena, I mean, it's nice, like, but you have to preserve it. Like, otherwise it'll just get bulldozed and we'll just have a bunch of Walmarts and strip malls, you know? So this is these great old state churches that there's some 20 some of them left, but they're the oldest wooden buildings in Europe. But then when I talked to my relatives about this, I found out that the town where my relatives came from had a state church. And I said, well, where did it go? Like, you talk about preserving everything and having it all, holding on to that past. And I found a photo of what the state church looked like, which is that it's kind of ugly, weird looking building. And they said, oh, that's state church. A rich man from Bergen came into town and said he wanted to buy that church and preserve it, and he would build a new church in its place. And so he brought that church to Bergen and set it up there as sort of a tourist attraction. And it's called the Fontov State Church. So if you've ever been to Bergen, you may have seen it. And this is what it is. Okay, but I looked at, you know, I visited it, and I was like, how can that be the same building? It's like completely different. And I realized they were building it, rebuilding it to make it look more quote unquote Norwegian, right? So to be more Norwegian, you have to have, you know, the dragons off the eaves and this little arcade going around and all of that, because that's more authentic, supposedly. And I thought, like, well, what is it, you know, going back to that idea, well, what does it mean to be Norwegian? Is it all like, you know, Lefse and Lutefisk and Runegrot? And so this church also, what happened, okay, in the 1990s, there was this whole heavy metal music movement out of Oslo called black metal. And they wanted to be like really tough and really mean and really loud and everything, because in Sweden they had the death metal music and they wanted to be worse than them, the black metal movement. And what they did, these black metal musicians decided, that in Norway, the Christians had ruined it for everyone. Like they needed to get back to what the Vikings did, right? And the Vikings, how they kill and drink blood, and like the idea of skull is like, you're drinking from a skull, right? And this whole terrible stuff, right? And those are the real Vikings, the real Norwegians, according to these black metal musicians. And so the Christians ruining everything, what they decided they needed to do is burn down churches, right? And they did. They burned down a whole bunch of churches across Norway, including the Fontau Stave Church. Okay, so they burned it to the ground, and then they took a photo of it smoldering there in the ashes and put it on the cover of their record. Okay, yeah, it really happened. And like the crazy stuff. Okay, and then the irony of this all is that the Vikings actually became Christians like in their last period, right? And started building these state churches, right? So it's never like quite so clean as all of that. And then they rebuilt this church again. So this is the rebuilt version of a church that was not really what it was in the first place. So like, what version of the history are you actually having? Because and then I thought here in the Midwest, we have a lot of these replica state churches. There's one up in Moorhead, Rapid City, South Dakota, Minot. There's a couple up in Door County. And then there was one that was made over outside of Trondheim, a place called Orkanger. That's this one that they brought over in 1893 for the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, the big kind of World's Fair they did in Chicago. So when the Columbian Exposition, Columbian, of course, means Columbus. And so the Norwegians were not too pleased with that because they knew that Leif Erikson had made it over here before. But at that point, it hadn't been proven. It's just all the sagas and such. I mean, only later did they find the Onso Meadows in Newfoundland, the actual colony, one of the little places they stayed. Anyway, so they made this church, brought it over there, set it up. They also made a replica Viking ship that they sailed across the Atlantic, through the Erie Canal, across all the Great Lakes to Chicago, just to prove that the Vikings could have made it there, too, right? Supposedly. Okay. So I thought about this church from 1893 that then moved to Little Norway in southern Wisconsin. I visited it there, and then when I went back, it was gone. Because about 6 years ago, Little Norway, which is like a little museum there, it went bust, and they didn't know what to do with this church. So people from Orkanger in Norway dismantled it, and brought it back to Norway. And now they have it there. So I visited the same church in 2 different countries. Okay, and so they have it as like Midwestern Norway, right? So if you go over there, you can visit it. And I thought, well, what makes this one any less authentic than this one, which has been rebuilt twice to what it never really was in the first place? That this one is actually older, right, in a way. So around Sundemai, with everyone out there waving their flags, they're just flags everywhere. And I watched the festival with one of my classmates in Trondheim, who's German. And he looked at all the flags and was like, no, this is not good. And I realized from a German point of view, you see everybody out there waving their flag, and he's like, okay, well, this means something very different if it's all these German flags out there. And the Norwegian said, oh, that's what we do. It's all for Norge, it's all for Norway. And he said, okay, that's fine as long as you're sort of inclusive and it's not xenophobic and too nationalistic and everything, because once this gets going, it can turn ugly pretty quickly. So at the end of the big Constitution Days, it's Sundemai, they all go out. I thought they would go out for, lutefisk or something, right? Instead, they're all going out for pulsed and iskrem, so hot dogs and ice cream. It's like kind of the national dishes of Norway, really. Yeah, so, and they just see these pulsed everywhere. It's one of their sausages. So with taking Aleph around to show all of these things, all those beautiful state churches and everything, I pointed out even the manhole covers in all of the town was just incredible. All the cobblestones, and each one of them was like a piece of art, that just the attention to detail, kind of preserving the town, the small town, that history was incredibly important to them. And as a 15-year-old, he could care less. He wanted this like youth culture and all of that, because I realized that I was looking to the past, and like what that Norway had from the past and kind of preserving that. And he was looking forward. So he was, there's these posters for May Day, anti-war, anti-capitalism. Here was one of the Rus, one of the crazy graduating high schoolers walking around. There's these occupied houses, kind of these squatter houses of artists and musicians in Oslo, right along the river there, that had all these fun things that were happening. So this is what he wanted. He wanted all the things that are happening in the future, all this. And so, but in the end, he finally let me take a photo of him in front of one of the old classic huttas, even though he didn't want his photo taken. All right, thank you. Yeah, are there any questions or comments or rebuttals or?
That last picture struck me.
This one?
Really. Not that one, the one with the flags.
Oh,
And all I could see there was the swastika. Now, what's the attitude over there between Nazism and the Norwegians?
Well, considering Norway was occupied by the Nazis, they're
Yeah.
not too proud of. They don't really like. Yep. Do you have a comment about it?
I can add to that.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to go there. My father was born there. Anyway, on the bus tour, my last name ends with an ER, sounds very German, and it is. It was my husband's name. Anyway, this guide asked in the bus if and she was gonna talk about the Nazi invasion, excuse me. Anyway, she was wondering if, if there were people that were partisan to the Germans. And probably looked at the list, and I don't recall, of all the people, if they had Germans on their names or not, but she was gonna be careful. How they spoke of it, but there is a lot of negative still towards the German invasion. Nazis.
Yeah, and for them, it was interesting, a lot of the resentment, I mean, historically, has been against the Swedes too, because so Norway and Sweden are like, Wisconsin and Minnesota, like they're kind of the same thing, they're brothers, whatever. And then, so Norway is occupied and then Sweden stays neutral and kind of lets it all happen. And so that sort of, that resentment. And then with the Germans, I mean, I think it's been enough time that like the younger generation, I mean, they go to Germany and they do there are lots of German tourists and everything. So, I mean, it's a historical thing, but it's not forgotten, definitely. And also now with NATO and, now that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, I mean, they're very worried about Putin. And so that's sort of the new thing, that like Putin, like all of these little, things like these submarines, these Russian submarines that are coming around in the fjords and poking around and doing all this stuff. I mean, so that's sort of the new thing, because but at the same time, they remember, like in northern Norway, it was the Russians, the Soviets, who liberated northern Norway, right? So there is, even though there is this tension, there's also, I mean, they're neighbors. So there's a lot of history there. Does that answer your question?
Pretty good.
Right.
No, I know, there were so many and I'm just trying to get my brain to. But if there was somebody else that had something. So do they have a lot of immigrants there? Because I know a lot of places, like a lot of times I'm paying attention to Europe and the news from there because I got disgusted with American news. It's all lies. So I'm looking everywhere around the world to find out or to piece together based on what everybody's saying. And it seems they're more nervous because somebody pointed out, if you're traveling through Europe in 3 hours, you could be through 3 countries, 4 countries. And in America, 3 hours, you're still in the same state. you haven't left. So we don't have a sense of, it's so easy to invade, because even if like Canada or Mexico invaded, there's a whole lot of us who, it would take a while before they got to us. And stuff, so it seems like there's questions about immigration and there seems to be some instability in Europe going on.
Oh, yeah, I mean, incredibly though, like with the European Union, I mean, they won the Nobel Peace Prize because they've kept them relatively at peace, right? So I mean, there's a couple of things going on. So one of the, so Norway is not part of the European Union, but they're part of the whole Schengen agreement of free borders, right? And so if you have immigrants, for example, coming up from Libya, going over to Lampedusa, like way southern Italy, the little island there, technically they're on European soil, or they are on European soil, and so they can go anywhere. Right. But of course, then when some of the immigration things happen, like Austria closed down their borders and this and that and others. So yeah, in Norway, I mean, Scandinavia in general, Sweden has had a lot of immigrants there. Norway has, and it's difficult trying to incorporate new people into your society who come with different ideas. But they also recognize, and this is one of the things going back to the oil fund, that a lot of people don't want to do like janitorial work or this kind of hard work. I mean, we have the same thing here, like, and they also, one of the reasons they give that big birth benefit is because they want people to have babies. Because otherwise you have a negative birth rate.
Right.
And then it's an aging population. I mean, Japan, it's like a huge problem there.
Yeah.
Because they don't really allow immigration at all to Japan. And so Norway, the biggest, what do they say? Like the largest group of immigrants, I think, are from Poland and Sweden. Okay, because they come over there and they can work, and you know, I mean, Sweden and Norway, that's kind of whatever. It's like, but so they have, and then how do you incorporate? Like, if you have someone from, you know, Uganda or whatever coming up, it's like it's a very different culture, and then cold and all of that. And one of the things they tried to do is they thought, okay, well, we don't want just them all to stay in Oslo and like form a little community. We want to bring them all over the country, and so you can kind of really incorporate them in. Problem is, you bring someone from, say, Africa, and you put them up north of the Arctic Circle, just their family alone, it's not going to go well. They don't speak the language and all of those, you know, and so they've had to kind of reconsider some
Dark.
Something you, excuse me, you just said made me remember reading when Denmark was named one of the happiest. I think it was the Blue Zones author who also in Minnesota. And he talked in there about in Denmark, people who were, for instance, garbage collectors or janitors were paid very similarly to college professors or, you know, CEOs. Is that similar in Norway? Are people, you know, those sort of lowly jobs paid similar to others, or?
Yes. I mean, I don't know about it, the same as a college professor, or you know, but I mean, yes, you can actually live on those wages. And one of the important things is you have healthcare from the government, you have, you know, of like other services, like all the education, all these other things that the government provides. So you're not, I mean, when I would explain to Norwegians that, okay, people in the US, if you have a big, you know, healthcare crisis, whatever, and your insurance, or maybe you don't have insurance, and that people actually go bankrupt because of healthcare, it's inconceivable to them, right? So even if you're working at, you know, a 7-Eleven, you can usually live on that. I mean, maybe not well, but you know, because other services are sort of provided.
So one of the themes of Bookends is about being a writer and the process of writing and your inspiration for becoming a writer. You have quite a few books. So could you speak a little bit about your process and your motivation, and where do your ideas come from? There were like 4 questions in there.
Okay. Well, with writing, I mean, I've always written, and it's just, and then played music and did other things, but then, I don't know, writing, it's kind of fun. It's very, But everyone said, oh, can you write something about this? Writing's hard, like, no, there's no doubt, and you have to redo things, and then some things are garbage, and you have to throw them out and stuff. But then a lot of, I mean, I carry a little notebook here, and then write down ideas about, you know, when you hear something interesting or a quote or something, when you gather things, and it's sort of this organic process. I mean, at the beginning, I always thought, oh, I should write the great American novel, but then there's always so much actual nonfiction, real things that are happening out there that it's very interesting as it is. So that's where, you know. And then just those experiences. Yes.
Is there a pervasive sense of community? I mean, it sounds like they're all in love with their country. Or is there any, I mean, what do they think of the United States? Do they look at us and think, what the heck are they doing?
Oh, yeah.
Where's the
Yeah, they're, okay. They would often talk about, oh, in Norway, like, well, we do this and we do that, and I thought, wow, I would never say that here. Like, I wouldn't say like, oh, we Americans, we think this, or, I mean, I don't know what people think now. Like, I mean, I know some people think maybe like I do, but and so, yeah, there is, especially around Sit in the Mine, all of that, there's this idea like we need to work together as a country. I mean, we may differ on many issues and stuff, but, you know, and I think, I don't know, I mean, they wonder what we're doing here, especially with guns. Because, I mean, they have a lot of, I mean, they hunt, there's a lot of moose and stuff. But yeah, so, and the politics here, I mean, trying to explain, they don't understand what's going on. And I think a lot of us are kind of confused too by, especially in this election season. But at the same time, some of the Norwegians would talk about Norway as the 51st state. Really? Because, I mean, English, everyone speaks English so well over there, and they're very clued into the United States. And so they're very tied here as well. And they know about Minnesota and Wisconsin and North Dakota, as, you know, we mentioned the colonies. We call them our colonies in America.
Right.
And then you get actually Norwegian tourist groups come over and they visit certain areas in Minnesota and I think, would I do that as an American, go over to say France and go to see like American places? Like, no. But yeah, they know about us, even though they're confused.
I'm an old Norwegian
Okay.
and grew up with a sense of patriotism for my America.
Mhm.
And now I'm hearing that's still alive in Norway, is
Yeah.
what you're saying, that love of country.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I think, I mean, it's just interesting here because, okay, with my grandfather grew up, I mean, my great grandfather came over and my grandfather grew up speaking only Norwegian and Swedish at home, kind of this mix. But then, you know, he was like American. And I said, well, why didn't you teach me Norwegian? Why didn't, like, I would love to be bilingual in Norwegian. But he said, no, we're in America, we speak English now, it's better. Okay. And then I learned in World War I, when all of a sudden all the anti-German stuff that, you know, Minnesota, like the biggest ethnic group is German, right? If you put the Scandinavians together, it's about the same, I think, maybe. But like, it became that if anyone spoke one of these other languages, like German or Swedish, Norwegian, anything, that you were suddenly suspected, and you could actually just be thrown in jail under being suspected of that. So it became sort of this enforced nationalism too.
Nationalism.
Which, you know, then they had sort of these Americanization committees in Minnesota, like the Minnesota Department, there was like this whole community thing that was supposedly kind of help people out, but they would go around and they would spy on people because they were worried that the Scandinavians were actually going to go towards the Germans and support Germany rather than that. So, I mean, I think of that my grandfather was very patriotic, but a lot of these Norwegians and Scandinavians who came over, and Germans, they wanted to hold on to that old, I mean, they love Germany and England and Scandinavia, and they wanted to hold on to that. So the idea that they became American, they kind of were pushed into that too, you know?
I guess I have to share the way my dad explained it to me. He was born in 1915. And by the time he got to school, they were required to speak English. And it came about after World War One,
Mhm.
when the army had all these people in and nobody spoke the same language. And they had terrific problems of communicating. And so after that experience, that's when that big push came, you need to learn English.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, which is good too. I mean, we want, like, we're doing all of this in English too, and I mean, I think English is a great language. But I would love to be able to be bilingual in Norwegian and, you know, and I think, you know, because right now, I'm actually on my way up north I run the Italian Concordia Language Village. And so like getting these kids young to learn a different language and, because, you know, we wait until junior high or high school to teach another language, and you gotta start them, yeah, especially with parents, right?
All right, well, thank you so much for
thanks.
this incredible.